Joy Division. Unknown Pleasures. The Joy Division mug. One fateful February afternoon, at the age of 16, I was in the city of Bath, southwest England, shopping for CDs at my local HMV. I bought 3 albums. The purchases that I made would go on to shape my music taste for the next 2 to 3 years, guiding me through the trials and tribulations of my teen years. Well, 2 of them would at least. The other one was the original eponymous album by Noel Gallagher and his High Flying Birds. As an avid Oasis fan at the time, I was keen to hear what the principal creative force of some of the biggest hits of the 90s was up to these days in the more recent time. To be honest, not a lot. I wasn't really expecting anything crazy, but an album full of advert music wasn't really it either, you know. The song aka What a Life was used to advertise the England football matches for Vauxhall, I think, in 2012. I don't know. It was during the Euros. I remember it. And with the exception of If I Had a Gun, which was a really sweet ballad written by Noel for presumably his significant other, I largely forgot the rest of the album, and it was destined just to sit on my CD rack for the rest of time. But I digress. The other 2 CDs were largely fundamental to my world outlook and the sense of well-being over the next couple of years, despite both largely being very depressing. One of which was OK Computer by Radiohead, and I mean, I'll talk about that in another video. I'm sure most of you watching have either listened to this yourself or you're acutely aware of the cultural impact of this album. I don't need to tell you how important this record is. Instead, I'm going to talk about the other CD that I bought, the one with the cool album art. Here I sit, Joy Division mug in hand, to talk to you about one of the most excruciatingly depressing yet influential records of the new wave era. Clocking in at just under 40 minutes of runtime, the album is filled with lyrics crying of existential dread, clunky angular guitar lines that anchor themselves to the deepest, darkest corners of your brain, and claustrophobic production that casts a gloomy light onto the simplistic minimal songwriting. Released at a time before the sludgy excess of glam rock and a stark contrast from the Mark Bolans and Bowies of the world that had preceded it, the record would go on to influence the entire new wave scene that followed. I'm talking about Unknown Pleasures. Where else could I start? When the record opens with this disquieting disorder, in my eyes, the manifesto of Joy Division. The reverb-drenched snare and kick pattern that starts the track gradually grows as layers of bass and guitar envelop this, before Ian Curtis draws back the figurative curtain and delivers his stark, baritone vocals from which he is famous. The overly spacious production is obvious right away, with lines such as "lights are flashing, cars are crashing" getting frequent now, referring to Curtis's epilepsy, mentioned a lot later on in the album, a condition from which he suffered his entire life. The alienation that Curtis felt becomes immediately obvious, a theme that has continued throughout the record. However, the most disconcerting part of this track is the chromatic bass line that ends it, drawing the curtain down on the opening track of this album, creeping up and down as the lyrics feeling are cried out in angst. As the record continues, these themes of desolation are continued, with the echoey production signature of the producer Martin Hannett. Working for Factory Records and recorded in Stockport, I can't think of many more industrial places that would sum up the feeling visually that goes into this record audibly. There's no hate towards Stockport, obviously. I'm sure it's lovely in certain spots that I haven't been to, but if you've been there, you'll know what I mean. As much as I think the band are the principal creative force behind this record, Unknown Pleasures wouldn't be the Unknown Pleasures we all know and love, without the production from Hannett. The band members have different opinions on the final mix of the record, produced by Hannett, which sounded completely different from any live recordings of them at the time. If you look that up on YouTube, you'll see a stark contrast between the much punkier, rockier sound of Joy Division live, saw any reverb or delay, interesting studio effects which added a whole new dimension of desolation to this album. Bernard Sumner, the guitarist of the band, who would later lead the rest of the group as the main singer in New Order, but more on that later, was particularly opposed to this approach and said the following: "The music was loud and heavy, and we felt that Martin had toned it down, especially with the guitars. The production inflicted this dark, doomy mood all over the album. We'd drawn the picture in black and white, and Martin had coloured it in for us. We resented it. Mojo 1994. And to put it more simply, Peter Hook, the bass player who would go on to join New Order with Sumner and Stephen Morris, the drummer, kind of put it up a little bit more succinctly, just saying, well, it sounded like Pink Floyd. And from that, I assume Joy Division did not want to sound like Pink Floyd. But meanwhile, Curtis, understandably, and the drummer Stephen Morris disagreed completely, believing that a sound need not be homogeneous between playing it live and recording it on the album. Regardless of what each band member thought, the doomy aircraft hangar-esque reverberations on Curtis's vocals and Morris's drum kit, especially his snare, perhaps my favourite production addition, became the Joy Division sound. As well as Disorder, there are two other songs that I'd love to single out when discussing this album. I'm just aware my mic is slipping. New Dawn Fades, which feels especially resonant during this coronavirus period in the UK and the world, especially with the threat of new restrictions forced upon us in the next few days. The lyric, "A loaded gun won't set you free," is perhaps one of the most haunting written by Curtis, obviously referencing his impending suicide, but he would undertake a few years later. Perhaps the rockiest moment on the album, but possessing this minimal, constant driving rhythms that would be popularized by krautrock beforehand, and the looping instrumentals from the guitar and bass that implies the electric, dance-driven sounds that New Order would pioneer later on in their career. The song is undoubtedly a breakup song, calmly analysing a past relationship, acknowledging its incompatibility and the numb, absent feelings that follow. A poignant and powerful statement. The other song that I'd like to talk about is She's Lost Control. The weird percussive sounds are the first thing that come to mind when discussing this track, particularly the pitch-shifted cowbell snare. I'm not exactly sure what Morris is whacking on this track. The soft descending bass line anchors the track, contrasting nicely with Sumner's clunky guitar line for which they're famous, used to powerfully emphasize the bridge sections within this song when Curtis doesn't sing. The lyrics describe an epilepsy victim with no control over her body, and written by an epilepsy victim himself in Curtis. This is a weirdly disturbing yet catchy listen. I don't really know how else to describe it, but it adds a completely different angle to the malaise described on this record, and contrasting the perils of modern industrialized society with the ills of the human condition. Why do I like this record so much if it's so depressing? That's a good question. You could ask literally anyone that. It makes me feel things. It's good art. That sounds so pretentious. It sounds so unique, different to the punk that preceded it and the dance music that followed. As well as this, there will never be another singer like Ian Curtis, as much as people have tried throughout the years. I can think of a few off the top of my head who have tried to emulate the dark baritone style in which Curtis sang, and haven't got close to the level of disparity and regret that Curtis manages to conjure up with his vocal tones. And sadly, Ian Curtis is no longer with us, having taken his own life at the age of 23, before the release of Joy Division's second and final album, Closer, which is an equally depressing album, and equally amazing, to be honest. I must cover it at some point on this channel as well. It's fantastic. His influence would be widespread, along with the rest of the bands, to multiple genres of music. Of course, we've talked about the new wave scene that followed, and the dance, electronic scene of the 80s. As well as this, I would definitely say it had a massive influence on the grunge movement of the 90s, where it became okay to make depressing music, and that for be widely accessible and people would enjoy it. I mean, look at Nirvana, who must have been massively influenced by Joy Division. But also, in more recent times, to rap music as well, and a lot of rappers have cited Joy Division as a massive influence, particularly this album, both aesthetically and the visuals of the album, that pulsar beam that's visualized, and now is on the t-shirts of goth chicks everywhere you go, which Vince Staples, I think, tried to emulate on his 2015 album, Summertime '06. Of course, the rapper Danny Brown referencing Joy Division with the name of his 2016 album, Atrocity Exhibition, which is named after the first track on Closer. Joy Division were an influential band, and this is one of the most influential albums of the late 70s, early 80s new wave scene. That's all for today. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this new style of video. It's been a while since I've uploaded, obviously. I'm trying a more scripted approach, a more video essay style thing. So if you like what you're watching, please, give it a like, helps the algorithm, obviously, you all know that. Subscribe for more content like this. Thank you very much for watching.